Welcome to Learning English, a daily 30-minute program from the Voice of America. I'm Jonathan Evans.
And I'm Ashley Thompson. This program is aimed at English learners, so we speak a little slower and we use words and phrases especially written for people learning English.
Today on the program, you will hear from Mario Ritter, Phil Deerking, and Alice Bryant. Later, Kelly Jean Kelly will present America's Presidents. But first, here is Mario Ritter.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in says North Korean leader Kim Jong-un hopes to meet again with United States President Donald Trump. The South Korean president spoke in Seoul after returning from a 3-day visit to North Korea. Moon told reporters that he will carry a private message from Kim to Trump about nuclear issues. He again promised to facilitate dialogue between North Korea and the United States. The U.S. and South Korean leaders plan to meet in New York City next week during the United Nations General Assembly meeting. Trump and Kim met in Singapore last June. At those talks, the North Korean leader promised to end his country's nuclear weapons program. The Associated Press reported that Moon said he would convey Kim's desire to formally end the Korean War by the end of the year. Moon also said he hopes that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will visit North Korea soon for nuclear talks. Pompeo had been expected to meet with North Korean officials last month, but Trump canceled the meeting, noting a lack of progress in negotiations. On Wednesday, North Korea agreed to close down its nuclear center at Yongbyon. It also offered to take apart its missile launching center at Dongchang-ri. In return, the North said it was seeking corresponding measures from the U.S. North Korea currently faces international sanctions that limit almost all of its exports and strongly limit imports from its few trading partners. The United States, South Korea, and Japan also have set their own economic restrictions on North Korea. Pompeo welcomed Wednesday's agreement and invited North Korean Foreign Minister Lee Yong-ho to meet him in New York City. The two are expected to meet during the UN General Assembly next week. On Wednesday, the South Korean president said Kim had agreed to visit Seoul before the end of the year. On the final day of Moon's trip to North Korea, Kim, Moon, and their wives visited the top of Mount Baekdu. The group had pictures taken at the mountain's summit. The ancient volcano is considered a sacred place in North Korea and is linked to the North's ruling Kim family. It also holds importance to both countries as the birthplace of the storied ruler of the First Kingdom of Korea. Mount Baekdu, which has a lake near its summit, also is the highest point on the Korean peninsula. I'm Mario Ritter.
The United States may have regained the position of the world's biggest oil producer sooner than expected. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says the country likely passed Russia as the world's top producer in recent weeks. It also reported that the U.S. passed Saudi Arabia in oil production earlier this year. The Energy Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Energy, released a report on September 12th. The agency said its findings were based on oil production estimates. If those estimates are right, it would mark the first time since 1973 that the United States has led the world in oil production, based on government records. The Energy Administration and another organization, the International Energy Agency, had predicted that the U.S. would not pass Russia and Saudi Arabia until 2019. The agency is an international group of oil-consuming nations. U.S. production rose in recent years partly because of technology including hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. Fracking is the use of chemicals, sand, water, and high pressure to break up rock formations deep below ground. This releases more oil and natural gas. Not everyone approves of fracking, however. Opponents say that fracking results in harmful substances entering groundwater. They also say it has increased the number of earthquakes in states like Oklahoma and Texas. The U.S. Energy Agency estimated that in August 2018, the United States produced an average of 10.9 million barrels a day. By comparison, Russia produced about 10.8 million barrels a day, with Saudi Arabia producing around 10.4 million barrels. The agency expects the U.S. will continue to produce more oil than Russia and Saudi Arabia for the rest of this year and through 2019. U.S. oil production has increased since 2011. The rate of oil drilling slowed after oil prices started falling in 2014. However, prices rose again as operators learned to produce oil more efficiently and oil prices recovered. The U.S. agency said its information on Russian production comes mostly from the Russian Ministry of Oil and also oil companies and industry publications. The agency said numbers on Saudi production are based on its own estimates. The United States led the world in oil production for much of the past century. However, both the Soviet Union and later Saudi Arabia passed the U.S. during the 1970s. Up until the past few years, it seemed unlikely the U.S. would ever become the top producer again. Daniel Yergin wrote a book called The Prize, which is a history of the oil industry. He says the increase in U.S. production helped avoid a severe shortage of oil that would have caused prices to rise even higher. I'm Phil Deerking.
Wildlife experts are reporting increasing numbers of Atlantic bluefin tuna in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantic bluefins are highly prized by the fishing industry. The fish can weigh up to 454 kilograms. Its meat is often used in sushi products sold at Japanese restaurants. But experts had been worried about the Atlantic bluefin. The species was listed as endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The United States government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says improved law enforcement appears to be helping the Atlantic bluefin recover after years of overfishing. The popular fish all but disappeared from the Gulf of Maine about 10 years ago. This year, fishers set a record by catching 30 Atlantic bluefin. One of the fish weighed 363 kilograms. International regulators have eased the catch limits for U.S. fishermen this year, increasing the quotas by more than 180,000 kilograms. But environmental groups warn increasing the new limits will undo years of wildlife protection efforts. Grantley Galland is an officer of global tuna conservation at the Pew Charitable Trust.
Scientists have been unable to determine whether or not the Atlantic bluefin population has recovered. So any decrease in the population now is bad for fishermen in the long term.
Tuna has been at the center of a long battle between the fishing industry and environmentalists. Fishers can make large amounts of money on a single fish. Environmentalists seek to protect the Atlantic bluefin. Yet many consumers are willing to pay high prices to eat them. Walt Golett is a professor of marine biology at the University of Maine. He says probably no other fish has been more politicized than the Atlantic bluefin tuna.
Imagine you are meeting a group of English learners to practice your speaking skills. The group leader puts everyone into small practice groups. The people in your group begin to ask each other questions. Here are some questions you might hear or ask.
What do you like doing for fun?
When did you come to the U.S.?
Where did you learn English?
These are all examples of object questions, and we are going to tell you about them today. Object questions are sometimes called WH questions or 5W questions because they begin with one of the 5 WH words: who, what, when, where, or why. They can also begin with how much, or how many. There is a simple, dependable pattern to remember when forming object questions. It is called quasm, and it works for most verb tenses. The QU in quasm stands for question word. The A stands for auxiliary verb. You may recall that auxiliary verbs, such as do, be, and have, are helping verbs that we use to form questions and verb tenses. The S in quasm stands for subject, and the M stands for main verb. Let's see how quasm applies to object questions in a few verb tenses. In the simple present and simple past tenses, we use a form of the verb do as the auxiliary verb. Here are some object questions in the simple present tense.
What do Americans eat for breakfast?
Where does she go to school?
Now we'll find quasum in one of these examples. In the question, what do Americans eat for breakfast? Our question word is what, the auxiliary verb is do, the subject is Americans, and the main verb is eat. Moving on to simple past, the form of do will always be did, which is the past tense. Here are some examples. Listen for the quasum pattern in each and make a note of the question word, auxiliary verb, subject, and main verb.
Where did you learn English?
How did you make that dish?
As we said earlier, object questions can also begin with how much or how many. We often use these phrases for questions in simple present or simple past tenses. And there is usually a noun after the phrase and before the auxiliary verb. Listen to two examples.
How much money did you spend on fall clothes?
How many cards do I have in my hand?
In these questions, the nouns cards and money do not affect the quasum pattern. You can think of the phrases how much or how many plus noun as the QU in quasum. So, what about object questions in other verb tenses? How do you choose an auxiliary verb for them? The answer is easy. Use whichever auxiliary verb that the verb tense uses. For example, we form the present continuous tense with the auxiliary verb be plus ing. In object questions, we put this verb tense into the quasum pattern. Listen for the pattern in these questions.
Where are you going for Thanksgiving?
Why is everyone standing around?
You can still hear the be plus ing verb tense, but it is separated by the subject in each question. Unlike the simpler tenses, some complex verb tenses in English, such as the perfect continuous tenses, have two auxiliary verbs. Object questions in such tenses do not follow the quasum pattern. The question, what has she been studying to prepare for the test, is an example. The auxiliary verbs has and been are separated by the subject. For the purpose of today's program, we will not focus on these complex verb tenses. Okay, here's something a lot simpler. Modal verbs, also called modals or modal auxiliaries. We sometimes call them modal auxiliaries because they are a kind of helping verb. Modals include can, could, should, might, would, and many more. Object questions containing modals also follow the quasum pattern. Listen for the pattern in these examples.
Where should I drop off my dry cleaning?
How can we improve our customer service?
Okay, that's our time for today. If you made it to the end of this three-part series, congratulations! Now I have 3 questions for you. What did you learn in this three-part series? Who can help you practice forming questions? Do you know what kinds of questions these are? For practice exercises and more, visit our website. I'm Alice Bryant.
VOA Learning English presents America's Presidents. Today we are talking about John Adams. In 1796, he was elected as the country's second president. Being second can be difficult, and being the second president of a new country, following a popular first president such as George Washington, turned out to be extremely difficult. For one thing, Adams did not always get along with other people. He was known to get angry easily and often. Adams also was leader of a divided administration. His own vice president often disagreed with him, passionately. The situation was the result of a rule in the Constitution at the time. It said the person who received the majority of votes became president. The person with the second largest number of votes became vice president. The rule worked fine for the first two elections. Washington had won the presidency, and Adams won the vice presidency. The two men belonged to the same political party and shared many points of view. But in 1796, Adams' opponent in the election, Thomas Jefferson, became the vice president. The two men were personal friends, but political enemies. President Adams supported a strong federal government that protected the interests of business and the wealthy. Vice President Jefferson, on the other hand, wanted to limit the power of the federal government. As a result, Adams and Jefferson often clashed. Adams also made what many historians consider a mistake in choosing his cabinet. Adams simply kept George Washington's official advisors, mostly to satisfy political opponents. But later, Adams learned that many of his cabinet members opposed him too. Historian John Ferling says, Adams was in over his head and started swimming upstream almost from the start of his presidency. On top of all that, Adams faced a foreign policy crisis. After the French Revolution, Great Britain allied with other European nations against France. They wanted to keep the unrest from spreading to their countries. Adams worked hard to make sure the U.S. did not get pulled into a war between France and Great Britain. But France did not trust the U.S. It tried to interrupt trade by seizing U.S. ships. Adams wanted to resolve the problem peacefully. He threatened military action, but he also sent diplomats to talk with French officials. Adams aimed for an honorable peace with France. It took some time, but he got it. Historian John Ferling says, although the crisis in Europe caused Adams endless trouble, he dealt with it well. Many years later, Adams wrote that the greatest jewel in his crown was reaching peace with France. Even if Adams struggled as president, he was successful in other parts of his life. He grew up outside the city of Boston. His father was a farmer, as well as a church official and town leader. However, Adams chose to attend Harvard University and become a lawyer. Adams was a very good lawyer. In fact, he was one of the busiest lawyers in Boston. His success enabled him to buy a big, two-story house that still stands in Quincy, Massachusetts. Adams also had a happy marriage. The relationship between him and his wife, Abigail, is one of the best known of that time. The two wrote many letters to each other during the years they were apart. More than 1,000 of their letters still survive today. John and Abigail Adams were both passionate patriots who supported the American Revolution. They also agreed about the issue of slavery. Unlike many founding families of the U.S., the couple did not own slaves and spoke out against the system of people owning other people. In November of 1800, John and Abigail Adams moved to the Executive Mansion in Washington, D.C. Adams was the first president to live in what we now call the White House. They would not stay long, however. Adams was facing a difficult re-election campaign. His vice president, Thomas Jefferson, was running against him. His party was divided. Many Federalists supported other candidates, and some voters did not like his decisions, including creating a permanent army, raising taxes, and limiting the rights of immigrants. Those four laws, called the Alien and Sedition Acts, extended the time that immigrants had to wait before becoming U.S. citizens. They permitted the government to detain citizens from enemy nations without reason during wartime. The laws also permitted the president to expel foreign citizens he believed were dangerous. And they made criticizing the president or Congress a crime. Adams said the acts aimed to control people in the U.S. who supported France. But many politicians at the time argued that the laws mostly affected people who supported the opposing political party. Historian John Ferling says they were right, and he says Adams may have been using the Alien and Sedition Acts to protect his political career, but they ended up damaging his public image. They also raised the question for the first time of whether states had the right to ignore a federal law if they disagreed with it. Supporters of Vice President Thomas Jefferson used Adams' approval of the Alien and Sedition Acts against him effectively. Jefferson's campaign said Adams exercised so much power as president that he must want the U.S. to become a monarchy. Adams' campaign said Jefferson was a radical who would bring revolution to the country. The U.S. had never experienced such an ugly election before. Some people wondered whether the country would be able to transfer power peacefully. When Jefferson won, however, Adams did not resist. He retired to his farm in Massachusetts. Adams spent most of his retirement writing. He even began exchanging long letters with his old friend and old enemy, Thomas Jefferson. The two men discussed their families, their thoughts on politics and religion, and their nation's history. The letters were both personally and historically meaningful. Adams and Jefferson were the last living members of the original patriots who started a new country. On July 4th, 1826, the nation's 50th birthday, the two friends, patriots, and former U.S. presidents died within hours of one another.
And that's our program for today. Listen again tomorrow to learn English through stories from around the world. I'm Jonathan Evans.
And I'm Ashley Thompson.